The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Patricia Morgan read the final verdict. Gregory Carter sat alone at the defense table with nobody beside him. His lawyers had left him hours ago because they had no more money to pay them, and they did not want to damage their careers by standing with a man everyone hated. The charges against him were serious and covered crimes across 3 different solar systems. Gregory had built a company called Stellar Industries that became one of the biggest businesses in the galaxy, but the prosecutors proved that he had done terrible things to achieve his success. The evidence showed that Gregory had exploited alien workers and treated them worse than animals. He had broken 17 different treaties between species that were supposed to protect everyone's rights. His company had also conducted genetic experiments on living beings who could think and feel just like humans, but Gregory treated them as if they were just objects for testing. The prosecutors had spent 5 years gathering all the evidence, and now they presented it to the court with representatives from both human governments and alien civilizations working together to bring him to justice. Gregory stared down at the shiny table in front of him and saw his reflection looking back at him, but the face seemed like a stranger. This was not the confident billionaire who used to walk into boardrooms and make decisions that affected billions of lives across dozens of planets. Now he wore a cheap borrowed suit because all his money and property had been frozen by the courts. Outside the building, thousands of protesters from many different species gathered and shouted for justice. Inside the courtroom, even the people whose job was just to record what happened would not look at him. When Judge Morgan finished reading his sentence, Gregory barely moved or showed any emotion. She sentenced him to 200 years in the Kepler Maximum Security Facility, which was known as the harshest prison in human space. He had known this was coming for months as the trial went badly for him day after day. What surprised Gregory was that he felt nothing inside. He expected to feel fear about spending the rest of his life in prison or anger at the people who testified against him, but instead he just felt empty and hollow, like something important had been removed from inside his chest. The bailiff started walking toward him to take him away to the holding cells, but before they reached his table, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. An elderly black man wearing a janitor's uniform pushed a cleaning cart into the room. He seemed completely unaware that court was still in session and that he was interrupting one of the most important trials in recent history. The janitor moved slowly and carefully, like someone who had done this same job for many years and knew exactly how to do it without thinking. The bailiff stopped and looked annoyed at the interruption. Judge Morgan frowned from where she sat high above everyone else. The janitor, whose name tag read Marcus, moved through the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps. He emptied the trash cans one by one without rushing. He appeared to be in his 70s with dark, weathered skin and hands that showed the marks of many years of hard work. Everything about him seemed ordinary and unremarkable, except for his eyes, which were surprisingly clear and sharp for someone his age. One of the bailiffs called out to him in an irritated voice. He told Marcus that court was still in session and he needed to come back later to do his cleaning. Marcus looked up at the bailiff and apologized in a soft voice that had an unusual accent that Gregory could not identify. He explained that his supervisor had told him to clean all the courtrooms before the evening shift started and promised he would only need a moment to finish his work. Something in the way Marcus spoke made the bailiff hesitate and not push the issue further. Judge Morgan wanted to finish the proceedings and go home after a long, difficult trial, so she waved her hand impatiently. She told the bailiff to let the janitor finish his work quickly since they were almost done anyway. Marcus nodded his head to thank her and went back to pushing his cart and collecting trash. As Marcus moved past the table where Gregory sat, he seemed to stumble slightly and caught himself by grabbing the edge of Gregory's chair. His hand brushed against Gregory's shoulder for just a brief moment, but that simple touch created a strange sensation. Gregory felt like electricity ran through his entire body, waking up every nerve. It was not painful, but it was so intense that he could not help gasping out loud. He quickly turned to look at the janitor, but Marcus had already moved on and was pushing his cart toward where the jury usually sat. Judge Morgan heard Gregory gasp and looked at him with suspicious eyes. She asked if he was all right, but Gregory found himself speaking words he had not planned to say. The words came from his thoughts, but he had not meant to speak them out loud. He said that the man was not human. As soon as those words left his mouth, Gregory knew that everything was about to change in ways he could not imagine. The janitor stopped pushing his cart and stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom, while everyone stared at him in shock and confusion. The courtroom exploded into chaos the moment Gregory spoke those words. The bailiffs immediately pulled out their weapons and pointed them at Marcus, who stood frozen in place next to his cleaning cart. Judge Morgan started banging her gavel on the wooden surface of her bench over and over, while shouting for everyone to calm down and restore order. The spectators in the gallery jumped to their feet and some of them screamed, while others tried to rush toward the exits. Security guards blocked the doors to prevent anyone from leaving until they understood what was happening. Marcus very slowly raised both his hands with his palms facing outward in the universal gesture of peace and surrender. He spoke again, but this time his voice sounded different. It seemed to fill every corner of the large courtroom and everyone could hear him perfectly, even though he was not shouting. He said that he meant no harm to anyone and explained that he was only there to observe and to offer a choice to Gregory Carter. His calm words did little to reduce the panic in the room. The lead bailiff kept his weapon trained on Marcus and shouted at him to identify himself immediately. He demanded to know what species Marcus belonged to, what planet he came from, and why he had used deception to enter a secure government building. The other bailiffs spread out to surround Marcus from different angles while court security called for backup. Judge Morgan reached for the emergency beacon on her bench that would alert federal marshals, but she hesitated before pressing it. The janitor's appearance began to change right before everyone's eyes. His form started to shimmer and wave like heat rising from hot pavement on a summer day. The plain janitor uniform faded away and was replaced by simple robes colored deep midnight blue that seemed to contain tiny moving stars within the fabric. His elderly human appearance remained the same, but now everyone could see that it was just a disguise or a shell covering something far older and stranger than anything they had encountered before. Marcus spoke again and told them his name, at least the name that human languages could pronounce. He explained that his actual species had no designation that humans would recognize or be able to say. He described his people as travelers who observed different civilizations as they reached crucial turning points in their development. He said he had been watching humanity for 300 years, starting from when humans first left Earth and joined the larger galactic community. His words were measured and calm, as if he was used to having weapons pointed at him. Judge Morgan had recovered from her initial shock, though her hand still hovered near the emergency beacon. She told Marcus that he had violated multiple judicial security protocols and was under arrest for infiltrating a federal courthouse under false pretenses. Several other charges would likely be added once security finished reviewing what had happened. She spoke with authority, but there was uncertainty in her voice because she had no idea what she was actually dealing with. Marcus turned to face the judge directly and spoke with respect in his voice. He told her that he was beyond her jurisdiction, though he genuinely respected the laws she worked to uphold. As he spoke, he made a small gesture with one hand, and suddenly the entire courtroom was sealed inside a bubble of soft golden light. Everyone inside could still see out through the walls and windows, but Gregory somehow knew instinctively that no one outside could see or hear what was happening within the bubble. The golden light felt warm and safe rather than threatening. Marcus continued speaking and said he would submit to the court's authority very soon, but first he needed to complete his purpose for being there. He declared that Gregory Carter's trial was not yet finished. Those words sent a chill through Gregory's body. He thought his trial was over and his fate was sealed, but apparently this strange being had other plans. Gregory looked around at the frozen faces of everyone in the courtroom and wondered what could possibly happen. Next, Judge Morgan stood up from her bench and walked down the steps that separated her from the main floor. This was highly unusual because judges normally remained elevated above everyone else, but the situation had gone far beyond normal procedures. She approached Marcus carefully while the bailiffs kept their weapons ready. She asked him what he meant when he said the trial was not finished. Gregory had been tried fairly under the law and convicted by the evidence. What more could there possibly be? Marcus smiled, but it was a sad smile that made him look even older than his disguised appearance suggested. He explained that humans had judged Gregory by his actions and found him guilty, which was their right and their duty under law. However, Marcus was offering a different kind of judgment that would measure not what Gregory had done in the past, but what he might yet do in the future. This made no sense to anyone in the courtroom, and they waited for him to explain further. Gregory felt his heart beating faster as he wondered what this ancient alien wanted from him. Marcus waved his hand through the air, and suddenly holographic images began to appear all around the courtroom. The images floated in three-dimensional space, showing scenes from different moments in time. Gregory recognized them immediately as moments from his own past. The courtroom watched in silence as Gregory's life unfolded before their eyes like a documentary that no one had permission to film. They saw a much younger Gregory working at a computer in a small apartment with pizza boxes stacked on the desk and empty coffee cups covering every surface. He looked exhausted but determined as his fingers flew across the keyboard writing code that would eventually become the foundation of his first software company. The images shifted to show Gregory a few years older standing in front of investors and pitching his ideas with passion and enthusiasm. His eyes shone with genuine belief that he was going to make the world a better place through technology. The investors were skeptical at first, but Gregory's conviction won them over. More images showed him working 80 and 90-hour weeks, refusing to give up even when his first product failed, and he had to start over. He slept in his office and lived on instant noodles because he poured every cent into building his dream. Then, the images showed his first major success when his company went public and he became a millionaire overnight. Gregory watched himself celebrate with his small team of employees who had believed in him from the beginning. He gave them all generous bonuses and stock options because he wanted everyone to share in the success. At that moment in his life, Gregory still remembered what it was like to struggle, and he treated his workers with respect and gratitude. The people in the courtroom saw this, and some of them looked confused because this was not the monster they had come to hate. But Marcus did not stop there. The images continued forward in time, and everyone watched as subtle changes crept into Gregory's behavior. Success led to more success, and his company grew larger. He started spending less time with his workers and more time with other wealthy executives and investors. The images showed him in expensive restaurants and private jets making deals that involved millions of credits. His clothes became more expensive and his smile became less genuine. He started talking about workers as resources and human capital, rather than as people with families and dreams. The images grew darker as they showed the founding of Stellar Industries and Gregory's expansion into space. They saw him approving plans to build orbital factories where conditions were harsh and safety regulations were minimal. When advisors warned him that workers were being injured and killed at alarming rates, Gregory dismissed their concerns and said that progress required sacrifice. The images showed him signing contracts to acquire alien labor at prices so low that it could only mean the workers were being exploited or enslaved. Gregory watched himself make these decisions and remembered how easily he had justified each one. More images appeared showing the genetic experiments that had been central to his trial. Gregory had approved research on sentient alien beings, claiming it was necessary to understand their biology for medical purposes. But the images showed the truth, which was that many of these experiments were designed to make alien workers more obedient and less likely to complain about their conditions. The researchers worked in secret facilities where no regulators could inspect their work. Alien subjects were held against their will and subjected to procedures that caused immense suffering. Some died on the examination tables while Gregory reviewed profit reports and never asked questions about where the data came from. The courtroom watched in horror as the full scope of Gregory's crimes played out before them. They saw families torn apart when Stellar Industries separated alien workers from their children and sent them to different colonies. They saw workers dying from exhaustion and preventable accidents while Gregory's company posted record profits quarter after quarter. They saw Gregory himself becoming harder and colder with each passing year until he seemed incapable of empathy or remorse. The man in those later images bore little resemblance to the passionate young programmer they had seen at the beginning. Marcus finally waved his hand again and the images disappeared, leaving everyone in stunned silence. He spoke in that same quiet voice and said that Gregory had begun with noble intentions, which was true for most people who eventually fell into evil. But power was a corrupting force, especially when it went unchecked for too long. Gregory had built an empire on the suffering of others and convinced himself that the end justified the means. He believed his vision for humanity's future was worth any price, even if that price was paid in the lives and dignity of others. Gregory wanted to argue and defend himself, but the images had shown the truth too clearly for any denial to work. He had watched his own transformation from an idealistic young man into someone who valued profit and power above everything else, including basic decency. His throat felt tight and tears began streaming down his face as the weight of what he had done truly hit him for the first time. For years he had avoided thinking about the individual victims of his decisions by focusing on abstract goals and statistics. Now he could not hide from the reality anymore. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, saying that he knew what he had done, and he knew what he had become. There was no defiance left in him, only exhaustion and shame. Marcus looked at him with those ancient, penetrating eyes and asked if Gregory truly understood. Then Marcus presented his offer. He said he had the power to remove Gregory from the timeline entirely. Gregory would never have existed at all. His company would never have been founded. The millions of beings who suffered under his rule would live completely different lives, free from that pain and trauma. Gregory's heart suddenly filled with hope at the possibility of undoing all the harm he had caused. For a brief moment he imagined a universe where none of his victims had ever suffered, because he had never existed to hurt them. But Marcus was not finished speaking. He continued explaining that if Gregory was erased from existence, then humanity would also lose all the technological advances that he had pioneered. The medical breakthroughs that came from his company's research would never happen, even though some of that research was conducted through ethical means. The 3 colony worlds that Stellar Industries had established would remain empty and unused. Marcus went on to explain that approximately 800,000 humans had lived good lives because of opportunities that Gregory's company created. These were employees who were treated well and paid fairly, especially in the early years before Gregory's moral decline. There were families who prospered and children who received educations because their parents had good jobs at Stellar Industries. If Gregory was erased from the timeline, then all those specific people would also disappear. Different people would exist in their place, living different lives, but those particular 800,000 individuals, with their specific memories and relationships and accomplishments, would be gone as if they had never been born. The courtroom erupted into arguments as people tried to process what Marcus was offering. Judge Morgan was the first to find her voice, and she spoke with outrage in her tone. She asked if Marcus was seriously asking Gregory to choose whether he should have existed at all. This seemed like playing God in a way that violated everything the judicial system stood for. Justice was about holding people accountable for their actions, not erasing them from reality. Marcus turned to face the judge and gently corrected her. He was not asking Gregory to do anything. He was offering a choice that Gregory was completely free to refuse. If Gregory said no, then the timeline would continue exactly as it was. Gregory would serve his 200-year sentence, and history would unfold according to natural causation. But if Gregory accepted the offer, then reality would reshape itself around his absence, and no one, except Marcus, would remember that Gregory Carter had ever lived. One of the alien observers in the gallery stood up abruptly, with anger radiating from their crystalline body. The Centauri delegate shouted that this was monstrous. Marcus was proposing to erase millions of lives based on the choice of one guilty man who had proven himself to be selfish and cruel. How could anyone trust Gregory to make a decision that affected so many others? The delegate's voice shook with emotion as they spoke about the arrogance of offering such power to someone who had already demonstrated a complete lack of moral judgment. Marcus listened to the objection with patience and then turned to address the entire courtroom. He spoke about how life was not a simple equation where you could add up all the good things and all the bad things and come to a clear answer. Gregory Carter was guilty of terrible crimes, and no one was disputing that fact. But he had also funded the research that cured Tacarian plague, which was a disease that had killed billions of people across multiple species. He had established the first human and alien educational exchange program that helped break down prejudices and build understanding between different civilizations. His early artificial intelligence ethics frameworks were still being used across 70 different star systems to ensure that AI development did not spiral out of control. Marcus explained that if you removed Gregory from existence, then you removed all of these positive contributions along with all the negative ones. The universe did not allow you to pick and choose which parts of a person's impact you wanted to keep. It was all or nothing. Gregory stared at Marcus in confusion and asked why he was being given this choice. Why offer this to him and not to other criminals who had done equally terrible things? There had to be millions of people throughout history who caused great harm. What made Gregory special enough to deserve this kind of cosmic intervention? Marcus walked closer to Gregory's table and explained that Gregory was at what he called a nexus point in human history. Gregory's trial and his fall from power had become symbolic to humanity in ways that went beyond just one man's crimes. Some people saw the trial as proof that justice could still reach the wealthy and powerful, who usually escaped consequences. Others saw it as a warning against human expansion into space and cited it as evidence that humans were not ready for the responsibilities they had claimed. How humanity processed and learned from Gregory's story would influence the development of human civilization for generations to come. Marcus knelt down beside Gregory's chair so that their eyes met at the same level. He said that beyond the symbolic importance, there was another reason for offering this choice specifically to Gregory. Most beings, when faced with the possibility of their own erasure, would cling to existence regardless of how much harm they had caused. Self-preservation was one of the strongest instincts in all living things. On the other hand, some people would choose erasure immediately out of overwhelming guilt or despair, without truly weighing the consequences. But Gregory was different because he was genuinely uncertain. He was actually thinking about whether the universe would be better off without him and trying to balance the value of his existence against its costs. Marcus said that this kind of genuine moral struggle was rare and precious. Most people were so certain of their own righteousness or so consumed by their own guilt that they could not truly examine the question objectively. Gregory's uncertainty meant he might actually make a real choice rather than just reacting from instinct or emotion. That capacity for honest self-examination, even in someone who had done terrible things, was worth acknowledging. Marcus stood back up and told Gregory that he would have 5 minutes to make his decision. After that, Marcus would submit to the court's authority and allow himself to be arrested and tried under human law. Judge Morgan stepped forward again and said firmly that she could not allow this to happen. Whatever Marcus was, he had no right to offer such a choice. Gregory Carter had been tried and convicted under the laws of the Terran Federation and the Interspecies Alliance. His fate had already been decided by proper legal processes. A mysterious alien being could not simply appear and override the justice system. Marcus nodded his head and acknowledged that the judge was correct. That was exactly why he was only giving Gregory 5 minutes, and then he would submit to her authority. She could arrest him and put him on trial and do whatever her laws required. But first, Gregory needed to make his choice. Judge Morgan started to object again, but was interrupted by a voice from the public gallery. A young woman wearing the green armband that identified her as a victim's rights advocate stood up with her whole body trembling with emotion. Her name was Lisa Quinn, and she spoke in a voice that shook with grief and anger. She said no with such force that everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her. She explained that her sister had died in one of Gregory's orbital factories. Her sister had been worked to death because Gregory wanted to increase his profit margins by 0.3%. That death was real and it mattered, and Marcus did not have the right to erase it. Lisa's voice grew louder as she spoke directly to Marcus. She said that her sister had existed and her life had meaning. Her death meant something even if that meaning was painful. If Gregory was erased from existence, then her sister's death would be erased too, as if it never happened. But it did happen, and pretending otherwise was an insult to her sister's memory. Lisa turned to face Gregory with tears streaming down her face. She told him that he did not get to run away from what he had done by choosing to never exist. That was the coward's way out. Gregory looked at Lisa and really saw her for the first time as an individual person, rather than just another face in the crowd. He saw his guilt reflected in her tear-stained face and felt the weight of her pain. He spoke quietly and told her he was sorry. He said he was so deeply sorry for what happened to her sister, and he knew those words were painfully inadequate. They could not bring anyone back or undo any of the suffering he had caused. Lisa glared at him and said that sorry was not enough to fix anything. But she admitted that it was a start. If Gregory was truly sorry, then he needed to serve his time and live with what he had done instead of running away into non-existence like a coward. Another voice joined the conversation, and this time it came from one of the alien delegates in the courtroom. Carlos Martinez was a centauri whose crystalline skin refracted light in rainbow patterns. He spoke in the careful, measured way that his species used when discussing emotional topics. He said that his people had benefited greatly from Gregory's medical research. His own daughter was alive today because of treatments that Stellar Industries had developed. He hated Gregory for what had been done to other members of his species who were exploited and experimented on. But he could not hate the fact that his daughter was breathing and living a full life. Carlos asked how one man could contain so much good and evil at the same time. It seemed impossible that the same person could save billions of lives through medical research, while also destroying individual lives through cruelty and exploitation. More voices rose from around the courtroom as both humans and aliens shared their perspectives. Some demanded that Gregory accept Marcus's offer and erase himself to undo all his crimes. Others insisted that he face his punishment and serve his sentence. The courtroom dissolved into a chaotic mix of arguments in a dozen different languages. Marcus watched all the arguing with an expression of deep sadness on his ancient face. He let the debate continue for several minutes before finally raising one hand. The moment he did so, complete silence fell over the courtroom instantly. Everyone stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to look at him. Marcus spoke to Gregory and told him to look around and see what his life had become. Gregory Carter was now a question that divided entire worlds. He was a puzzle with no easy answer. People could not even agree on whether he should exist or not. That was the true measure of how complicated morality could become. Gregory stood up from his chair and found that his legs were steadier than they had been earlier. He looked around the courtroom at all the faces watching him with such different emotions. Some were angry, and some were hopeful. Some showed hatred and others showed pity. He thought about Lisa's sister, whose name he did not even know. He thought about Carlos's daughter, who was alive because of research his company had funded. He thought about all the workers who had died in his factories and all the families who had built good lives because of jobs his company had provided. Everything was connected to him, flowing outward from choices he had made over the course of decades. He began to speak in a quiet voice that gradually grew stronger. He said that he had spent his whole life believing he was special. He thought that his vision and his goals and his ambitions were more important than individual lives. He had convinced himself that he could see the bigger picture and that he was building something important enough to justify any sacrifice. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. He called himself arrogant and monstrous for thinking that way. The sheer arrogance of believing his dreams mattered more than other people's lives seemed obvious to him now. Gregory turned to face Marcus directly. He said that Marcus had shown him that his existence was a mixed equation, where good and evil were intertwined so completely that removing one meant removing the other. But Gregory realized that this was not actually unique to him. Every single person who had ever lived left ripples of both light and darkness in the world. Some people's ripples were bigger than others, but everyone had an impact that was complicated and mixed. Gregory was just a bigger and more obvious example of something that was true for all living beings. He continued explaining his thoughts and said that the real question was not whether the universe would be better off without him. That question was impossible to answer because there were too many variables and too many people affected in too many different ways. The actual question was what he chose to do with the existence he had right now in this moment. He could choose to be erased and avoid all responsibility, or he could choose to face the consequences of his actions and try to make whatever amends were possible in the time he had left. Gregory turned to face Judge Morgan and addressed her formally. He told her that he did not want to be erased from existence. He wanted to face his sentence and accept his punishment. He wanted to spend whatever time remained in his life trying to make amends in whatever small ways he could. He knew this would not undo anything he had done. It would not bring back the people who died or heal the trauma of those who suffered, but erasing himself would not accomplish those things either. It would just erase their deaths as if they had never mattered in the first place. He turned to Lisa and spoke directly to her. He told her that her sister had existed and her life mattered. Gregory had taken her life through his negligence and greed, and that was a sin he would carry with him forever. He asked Lisa not to let him escape from that burden. He wanted to be forced to remember what he had done and who he had hurt. Erasing himself would be too easy, and it would rob his victims of the acknowledgement they deserved. Lisa stared at him for a long moment with tears still on her face. She did not smile or forgive him, but something in her expression shifted slightly as if she had not expected him to say those things. Marcus stood very still, and for the first time since revealing himself, Gregory saw something that looked like approval in those ancient eyes. Marcus spoke and told Gregory that he had chosen to exist and to face the consequences of his existence. More than that, Gregory had chosen to try adding more light than darkness to the universe going forward, even though his efforts would be imperfect and insufficient. Marcus said this was the choice he had hoped Gregory would make. Those words surprised everyone in the courtroom. Judge Morgan stepped forward with anger flashing in her eyes. She accused Marcus of manipulating the entire situation. He had set up this whole scenario knowing what Gregory would choose. It was not a real test if Marcus already knew the outcome. Marcus turned to face the judge and gently corrected her. He said that he knew what Gregory could choose, but he did not know what Gregory would choose. That distinction was the essential mystery of free will, and Marcus considered it sacred. Free will meant that even when someone knew all the possible options, they could still surprise you with which one they selected. Marcus turned to address everyone in the courtroom and spoke about humanity's place in the larger universe. He said that humanity stood at a crossroads in their development. Humans had achieved great things and built impressive civilizations, but they had also committed terrible evils. They were capable of breathtaking compassion and shocking cruelty, often within the same individual. Gregory Carter was not some kind of aberration or exception. He was a mirror that reflected the truth about humanity's dual nature. The golden light that surrounded the courtroom began to fade slowly. Marcus said that his observation of humanity was now complete, at least for this visit. He declared that humanity was not ready to join what he called the elder civilizations. Those were species that had evolved beyond the kind of conflicts and moral failures that still plagued younger races. However, humanity was also not the lost cause that some of Marcus's colleagues believed them to be. Humans were young and flawed, but they were also learning. The important question was whether they would learn fast enough to survive their own power. Marcus's form began to shimmer again as he started to dissolve like morning mist when the sun rises. He said that Gregory Carter would serve his sentence as the court had ordered. During that time, Gregory might do some good or he might cause more harm. That would be his choice to make and humanity's test to observe. Marcus explained that how humans treated their fallen leaders would reveal important truths about their civilization. How they balanced justice with mercy, and how they grappled with the complexity of good people who did evil things and evil people who did good things would define humanity's future path. Marcus faded until he was almost completely transparent with just a whisper of starlight, remaining in a vaguely human shape. His final words echoed through the courtroom even as his form disappeared. He said he would return in exactly 300 years to observe humanity again. He asked them to make him proud of what he found when he came back. Then he was completely gone, leaving no trace that he had ever been there except for the memories of everyone who witnessed what happened. The courtroom immediately burst into chaos again, but Gregory barely heard any of it. He felt the firm grip of the bailiff's hands on his arms as they began to guide him toward the door that led to the holding cells. As he walked past the public gallery, he caught Lisa's eye one more time. She did not smile and her expression was still hard, but she gave him a single small nod. It was not forgiveness, and Gregory knew he did not deserve forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement that she had heard what he said, and maybe that was enough for now. Judge Morgan's voice cut through all the noise and shouting. She demanded order and banged her gavel repeatedly until people slowly settled down and returned to their seats. She looked at Gregory with an expression that was impossible to read. Her face showed no sympathy but also no cruelty. She told him that he had been sentenced to 200 years in the Kepler Maximum Security Facility, and he would serve every single day of that sentence. But she was also remanding him to something called the Restorative Justice Program. The judge explained that under this program, Gregory would work under constant supervision to provide restitution to his victims and their families. His knowledge and skills would be put to use serving the people he had harmed. He would not be sitting idle in a cell. Instead, he would be required to contribute meaningful work that might in some small way begin to balance the scales. Judge Morgan asked if he understood what she was telling him. Gregory answered clearly that he understood. His voice was steady even though his future looked bleak and difficult. The bailiffs led Gregory toward the exit, and he took his first steps as a convicted criminal heading to prison. The courtroom watched him go, and in their eyes Gregory saw something he had not expected. He saw humanity's eternal struggle reflected back at him. It was the war between what people were and what they might yet become. Every person in that room was capable of both great good and terrible evil. They watched Gregory not just with judgment but with a kind of fearful recognition that they too could fall if they were not careful. As Gregory walked through the door, he glanced back one last time at the courtroom that had been the site of his downfall, and possibly the beginning of his redemption. The cleaning cart that Marcus had been pushing still sat abandoned in the corner of the room exactly where he had left it. The cart looked completely ordinary, like something you would see in any building being cleaned at the end of the day. Gregory wondered if Marcus had ever really needed a cart, or if it had just been part of the disguise. The holding cells were cold and gray. Gregory was processed through the system with the same procedures that applied to any other prisoner. They took his fingerprints and his photograph. They gave him a prison uniform to replace his borrowed suit. They assigned him a number that would be his primary identification for the next 200 years. Through all of this, Gregory remained calm and cooperative. He had made his choice, and now he would live with it. Days passed in the holding facility while transportation was arranged to Kepler. Gregory spent most of his time alone in a small cell with nothing to do but think. He thought about his life and all the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought about the victims whose faces he had seen during the trial. He thought about Lisa's sister and Carlos's daughter, and the hundreds of thousands of others affected by his decisions. He did not try to justify anything or make excuses. He simply acknowledged the truth of what he had done. When the transport ship finally arrived, Gregory was loaded onto it along with several other prisoners. The journey to Kepler would take 3 weeks. During that time, Gregory began to understand what the rest of his life would look like. He would work and study and try to find ways to contribute something positive. It would never be enough to balance what he had taken, but it would be something. He thought about Marcus's words about adding more light than darkness and decided that would be his goal, even if he failed more often than he succeeded. Back on Earth, something strange was happening at the courthouse. The cleaning staff had come to retrieve the abandoned cart, but when they found it, they discovered something impossible. The cart was filled with flowers from a dozen different worlds. There were blue roses from Centauri Prime and golden lilies from the Andromeda colonies. There were silver orchids from Kepler's moon and red chrysanthemums from Mars. All of them were blooming impossibly in the recycled air of the courthouse, where such plants should not be able to survive. Nobody could explain how the flowers got there. The cleaning staff reported it to their supervisors, who reported it to building security. Security checked all the video footage but found nothing. The cameras showed Marcus pushing an ordinary cleaning cart with nothing unusual inside. The flowers seemed to have appeared out of nowhere after Marcus disappeared. Scientists came to study the flowers and found that they were real living plants, not artificial decorations or holograms. The flowers kept blooming for exactly 300 days. Botanists were amazed because most cut flowers died within weeks, but these remained fresh and vibrant for months. People started coming to the courthouse just to see them. The flowers became a symbol, though different people interpreted them differently. Some saw them as a sign of hope. Others saw them as a reminder of the complexity of existence where beauty and tragedy could coexist. On the 300th day, something remarkable happened. All the flowers simultaneously turned to stardust. Witnesses described it as one of the most beautiful things they had ever seen. The petals began to glow with soft light, and then dissolved into tiny particles that sparkled like stars. The stardust floated in the air for a few minutes, creating patterns that some people swore looked like constellations. Then the dust faded away completely, leaving no trace behind. Gregory heard about the flowers while he was at Kepler. Someone sent him a news article about the phenomenon. He read it in his cell and smiled sadly. He understood that Marcus had left them as a message. The flowers represented all the lives touched by Gregory's existence, both the beauty he had created and the beauty he had destroyed. The 300 days matched the 300 years that Marcus said he would be gone, before returning to observe humanity again. Gregory folded the article carefully and kept it in his small collection of personal items. He returned to his work in the prison's restorative justice program. He was helping to design better safety systems for orbital factories, using his engineering knowledge to prevent the kind of accidents that had killed so many of his workers. It was hard work and emotionally draining because he had to constantly confront the consequences of his past choices. But he kept at it day after day. Years began to pass. Gregory settled into the rhythm of prison life. He worked and studied and occasionally received letters from people affected by his crimes. Some letters were full of anger and hatred. Others were more measured, asking questions or seeking closure. Gregory answered every letter honestly without making excuses. He did not ask for forgiveness because he knew he had no right to ask. He simply tried to acknowledge the pain he had caused and offer what small amends he could. Lisa visited him once after 5 years had passed. She came to the prison and sat across from him in the visitors area. They talked for an hour about her sister and about the work Gregory was doing. Lisa told him that she still hated what he had done, but she was glad he had chosen to face his sentence rather than erasing himself. She said her sister's life and death mattered, and having Gregory acknowledge that meant something. They parted without warmth, but with a kind of understanding. Gregory realized that this was what the rest of his life would be. He would never be free from his guilt, and he would never fully make amends for what he had done. But he could choose every day to add a small amount of light to the universe. He could use his knowledge to help prevent future suffering. He could acknowledge his victims and honor their memories. It was not redemption because some things could not be redeemed, but it was something, and that would have to be enough. 300 years was a long time to wait, but Marcus would eventually return to observe humanity again. Gregory would not live to see that day, but he hoped that when Marcus came back, he would find a humanity that had learned something from Gregory's story. Perhaps they would have learned to balance their ambitions with their compassion. Perhaps they would have found ways to achieve great things without crushing those who were vulnerable. Perhaps they would be worthy of joining the elder civilizations, or perhaps they would still be struggling with the same questions about good and evil, about justice and mercy, about the complexity of existence. Either way, Gregory had made his choice. He had chosen to exist and to face the consequences. He had chosen to try even knowing he would fail. That was all anyone could do, and it would have to be enough.